Greetings. I'm Dr. Daniel Foor, and I'm excited to be here today with Kumu Ramsay Taum for a conversation on Hawaiian traditions and culture. Kumu is an internationally recognized facilitator, educator, keynote speaker, lecturer, and he has been mentored and trained by respected kupuna or elders, and is a practitioner and instructor of several Hawaiian traditions, including Ho'oponopono, Lomihaha, and Kahivalu Lua.
That's
And
great.
he is we're happy to have him. And if you'd like to learn more about his offerings, see his website, Ramsay Taum, RAMSAYTAUM.com. And I'm also excited to be co-offering an event on Oahu in late April of 2019 with Kumu on ancestral healing, and also how to approach with great reverence and etiquette the occupied lands that are Hawaii. So with that, Kumu, I would love it if you're willing to lead us off with a prayer. And so it'd be great.
Well, I appreciate that, Daniel. Thank you for having me, and to everyone that's tuning in. Aloha from Hawaii. Yes, in Hawaii we call this a pule. A prayer, an invocation, a call, request for guidance, protection. So if you would mind just going to that quiet place and allowing me to share this with you, bring us into this space. E ho'olukono ono o ke kino a me ka ohane. E mālama pono ka mana'o ke ola ke kino I ka manawa a paulo. Aloha, aloha. Anoe ke me aloha. So in those words, we say unify mind, body, and spirit. To nurture, care for, and mentor that union, that unification through all time. Not just while we're here today, but when we leave this space and go about our business, so that we are all connected in some place. And in that ask, that request, that we are nurtured and cared for because we are connected. So thank you for allowing me to do that.
Beautiful, thank you. So Kumu, let's start, if we can, with just a bit about your own story, and perhaps one entry point would be, as someone who's come to be a lineage carrier in several different Hawaiian traditions, is this something that you inherited in a family lineage kind of way, or is it something you sought out? And how has it played out for you?
Yeah, there's an old saying about when the student is ready, the teacher appears, and the other way around. When the teacher's ready, the student appears. And I have to say that perhaps on a spiritual, deeper level, there was a seeking, but I can't consciously say, looking back, that I was consciously looking for particular teachers, and consider myself quite fortunate that they found me or we found one another. As is the tradition, it wasn't necessarily where our kupuna, as you mentioned earlier, our elders, or as some would refer to these particular elders as kahuna, those who had kept the wisdom of our ancestors and of our culture. It wasn't traditional that they would hold a large class, but instead identify certain individuals, and ultimately one individual that they would share some of this knowledge with, and for the purpose of passing it on, but also in some cases to kokua, to assist them in the delivery of their particular disciplines. So I was fortunate that through my life, these kupuna entered, and there was a time period, I would say between 15 and 20 years, that these different elders appeared, or I appeared in their lives. And it was at that point in time that they began to share their mana'o, as we say, their information and their ike, their knowledge and wisdom with me. And in doing so, shared what we call kuleana, responsibility. In other words, then becomes the responsibility of those who have received this to, one, kia'i, to guard, but also to share, and share with others. So today is an opportunity for sharing. And these elders, I think, would be pleased they were doing this. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
That's great. Yeah. I've heard you also describe yourself as a bit of a cultural bridge between
Yes.
Hawaiian traditions and other than Hawaiian traditions that are often present on the islands and impacting Hawaiian folks. And I'm curious if you could share just a little about how it is to move in that way in the world. And yeah.
Yeah, again, the gratitude of being able to stand in multiple worlds, if you would, because as many may know or may not know, Hawaii today, as we know it, is really part of the Western world, the United States, of course, that most people understand. But when we became part of that thinking, that way of being, more Western than rooted in our cultural practices, it required us to kind of be in both places. And so there was a time when my grandparents, who were raised in the culture, really kind of as far as I'm concerned, from a temporal standpoint, really the last connection back to the culture post-contact, I guess you would say. And so they wanted me to learn and understand this new world that we were facing or experiencing. So they didn't really want to share or have us learn Hawaiian language and culture. So I would say that I'm kin, if you would, to the state of Hawaii, which became a state in 1958. So really, this world is really more an American host culture than it is a Hawaiian host culture. I would like to say it's a rooted culture is Hawaiian, but the host culture of the place, currency, language, business practices are pretty much American. Mm-hmm. So growing up in that space and learning to navigate that space was important. So my education, my formal education, led me to the United States Air Force Academy, the University of Southern California, worked in Washington, D.C. So learning that lexicon, how to communicate, which was important to my kupuna, my elders who taught me, learn these ways, practice it, and understand it so that we can communicate. Mm-hmm. It was during that time that it became very clear by some of the elders that took me in, I'd like to say, who pulled my ear and said, come here with us, that it became clear that there was a need to translate, across those so-called invisible boundaries of culture. Mm-hmm. The practices of our ancestors. And I was reminded that I was being taught to be a good American. I was being taught to be a good participant in this other dominant cultural practice. And yet, to be clear, that there were cultural assets that perhaps many of us at the time period had not really connected to, had not learned well, because with intention, they were being careful about who they taught, where it went, so that it wouldn't be, abused or even misused, mm-hmm. or even lost. So as a result of that union, the combination, and the trust of these elders, that I became one of several individuals. There are many of us actually today. We're fortunate to be able to share this, the cultural practices of our kupuna. So as a bridge builder, or basically working between the two spaces, being able to align contemporary conventional thought with those of our kupuna. What I would call place-based, culture-based approaches to dealing with the opportunities and challenges of living in the 21st century.
It's good. Yeah, one of the questions that comes to mind is there's a pattern of, for so many different cultures that are have experienced the pressures and difficulties of colonialism, of just survival, and then a period of some sort of resilience and maintaining and preserving what's possible, and then ideally a resurfacing or reemergence or a cultural revival and renewal in a more open way. Is it the case that in Hawaii elements of that pattern are also present, and that there's a kind of more open time that's happening a bit now?
Yeah, some people would point back to 1977, 1978 as the so-called Renaissance period for us. That's right about the time that I was just getting out of high school, mm-hmm. As I date myself here. But that's really when the Polynesian Voyaging Society, under the guidance of Kupuna Pinky Thompson and his son Nainoa Thompson successfully navigated the sailing canoe, voyaging canoe called Hokulea. It was also around that time that we were benefiting from a group that was trying to reclaim the island of Kaho'olawe, which was being used as a bombing target range by the U.S. Navy and had been for some time. And so it was in that time that language, music, and some of these traditions like voyaging were being reintroduced. Now, the school I graduated from at that time was really the benefit provided to children of Hawaiian ancestry, such as myself, by Princess Bernice Pauahi Bishop, who was the great-granddaughter of Kamehameha, the unifier of the islands to create the kingdom. And it was during those times that some of these traditions were being revived and restored, but not in a colloquial way. But we tried to blend them into society. It was at that time that we began to understand, well, there was a different history, perhaps not the history that we're being taught in schools, but the history that began to surface. So that's when I think what had gone underground really began to surface. Everything from our hula, which actually came back a little earlier, which the one thing that I think was promoted more so because of the travel industry, visitor industry, tourism, marketing. But things like language. At that time, Hawaiian language wasn't considered a formal language in Hawaii. So it was then that the language was restored and actually we could speak it. And so schools were reinstituting that method of communication, which is very important for our culture, and I think many cultures,
sure,
because that's where knowledge transfer happens, right? It's through the stories, the mo'olelo, as we say, and through our chants and our oli. So it was during that time. So when the government was overthrown in 1893, many of these practices and the elders and teachers of these practices went underground. So I think like most things in nature that have resiliency, they kind of seek refuge in times of threat, and when things get better, they resurface. And I think that our culture has done this.
Yeah, I want to dive into some of the more cultural specifics, but I want to keep in mind that a lot of our listeners may know very little about Hawaiian traditions and culture. And so let's zoom out a bit and could you speak, what are 2, 3, 4 things that you would wish ideally that everyone who would, when they think about Hawaii or when it comes up in conversation or they know people who visited or whatever, that they would really take to heart, some basic aspects of history and culture and etiquette that are so essential that without them it's hard to show up well.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Daniel. Just the idea that Hawaii, and here I'm pronouncing that, there are spiritual energies anytime we utter these words, these concepts, and I'd like people to know that just in uttering the word, the name of this place, they're calling upon something very deep, something very spiritual, and that to be mindful that we come from and participate in a culture that has that kind of spiritual rootedness. The word Hawaii, for instance, in the roots, my kupuna, my elder would say, from root to fruit. The root of the Hawaiian language in this case is 3 words, can be broken down to ha, vai, and e. The first, ha, means life-giving breath, that spiritual breath, that energy that is in all of us, regardless of where we come from. The second word, vai, refers to the fresh water, life-giving water that comes from the heavens, lands on the mountain, feeds the land, and then ultimately becomes the ocean, the sea, and the Hawaiian word for that is kai. So you have vai to kai, fresh to salt. So here you have these 2 words, ha, life-giving breath, and vai, life-giving water. The last root word is called e, or the letter I. And e is a reference to io, the singular, the creative energy that not only produce ha and vai, but you and me. And so this creative energy, some would call God, nature, creation, is in all of us as well. And it refers to the spiritual connection between you, me, the place, others, but it is that what connects us all. So when you put these three terms together, Hawaii, it says the land of air, water, and spirit. Care for the air that you share, the atmosphere, the space that we may be in with others. To guard against what it is we feed ourselves and to others, whether it's water or food for mind, the body, and spirit. And then lastly, to care for our relationships with others as well as our places. Now, if you subscribe to that notion, then really what it says is regardless of where you are in the world, coming to Hawaii is one thing, but to go back to wherever you come from, care for the air, the water, the spirit of your relationships, you become Hawaii. And that's important. And I think Hawaii, this place, allows people to reconnect to that energy that then allows them to be wherever they are in the world. Hawaii, those that honor and care for the spaces they're in, the air we breathe, the water we drink, and those we share it with. So I think that's an important concept. It's not just a place to come and vacate, vacation or recreate in the absence of that context. Now, granted, anyone can come here for that purpose, but if there's anything I'd like people to understand is that's an important thing, because the next thing is aloha. But I hope that foundation is helpful.
Yeah, it's great. I'd like to expand into it some. If you encounter someone who's not Hawaiian, who nonetheless is expressing a lot of mindfulness and cultural respect and etiquette in relation to traditional Hawaiian folks or Hawaiian ancestor people, what are some of the things that they might be doing or not doing that would trigger you to be like, oh, this person's good form, like they're being mindful? Like, what are some other, and it could be ways that folks there like to refer to themselves. It could be, bits of protocol or etiquette. Could you expand into some of what those ways of communicating respect might be?
Yeah, I used the word aloha earlier, and I think Hawaii is known as the aloha state. And when we come here, it's used for everything from slogans to welcoming statements, etc. But I think someone who is mindful of the culture, any culture, will be mindful of their language, their practices, their spirituality, and the places in which they live. And so while they may be here on vacation, know that we don't leave, we still live here, right? So as you move through the communities, understand these are communities where people reside, live, worship, play, practice, work, do whatever they do. And so I would ask that anyone coming to a place like this or anywhere else that is not your own place to be mindful of that. And the concept of aloha is a spiritual concept that speaks about reciprocity, about giving and receiving. In days past, you would never go to someone's house empty-handed, knowing that in arriving, the practice or culture would require them by belief, by understanding, that they would be sharing their resources with you, food, water, hospitality, their home for rest, which means that they're using resources that are hard to come by, right? And so as you enter these places, you would then come hopefully with something that would replace the resources that you knew you were going to get. And what that demonstrates is an acknowledgement of those people that you're visiting who are opening their doors to you, that as they share, so do you. So the aloha concept is one of giving and receiving. Now, as you come to a place and you may not know an individual, but you still come to the place, I would say find a host. Look for someone that can guide you and direct you so that you're doing things properly and not something just out of a book. Or at least be respectful of the customs of that place and not expect your own customs to define the way others should treat you. If you're in someone else's place, at least be aware of what those customs are, even if they may not be your own, but at least you'll know where the lines are. You know how to respect them. And I think that's a real important concept. So the giving and receiving, the reciprocity agreement of aloha says to leave people and places better than when you found them, and not taking from them. And the extractive mindset, to perhaps using your term, the colonized practice, of coming and taking, right? Acquiring and owning, thinking about shares in the company rather than sharing, what's there in it. So these mindsets. So I would implore and ask anyone that comes to Hawaii or to places where culture is still very much alive, is to let the place change you rather than you change the place.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Why don't we expand a little, if you're open, into a conversation about some of the specific lineages of practice that you're a lineage carrier in and trained in. Perhaps you could start with the Lomihaha and some of the body healing arts, and I'll let you speak to that. But yeah, maybe help us to know what is it, and what does that art say about, kind of what is its place in the larger spectrum of Hawaiian traditions, and what would feel good to you?
Yeah. I've used the word spirituality several times, or spirit, and I'd like to say that in the culture, very few things, in fact, I don't know of any practice that wasn't connected spiritually, or there wasn't some spiritual discipline that came along with the mechanics, if you would. So the meaning versus the mechanics, and I think in that these particular practices are rooted, but they're also connected. So the Lomihaha, the Ho'oponopono, and the Kaihiwalo Lua, or Lua in and of itself, are really disciplines that are all intertwined. They're healing and they're balancing. The idea of bringing balance back to you physically, spiritually, mentally, as well as with the land. So in the case of Lomihaha, Lomi, as most people know it, is the practice of massage. In the massage world, that physical action of to use one's hand, the lima, they call that the massage. So we would say lomi. But the practice involves a lot more than that. It's just not the physical. In fact, some good practitioners may not even have to touch a person physically in order to generate the kind of healing that's necessary for the body, because they're connecting that person themselves to Akua, the divinity, to your spiritual identity, where really in the mind of the practitioner is where the heva, where the pain, the discomfort, the huki, the tension is actually occurring, and it's manifesting itself physically. But it's really a reflection of disorder or dis-ease and disconnection elsewhere. So Lomihaha is one of the practices of realigning muscle, bone, etc. But it does more the practice of palpation and being able to diagnose by touch, and beginning to understand and recognize where the mana, or the energy, is flowing or not flowing, to begin to restore that flow. Ultimately, it's all about flow. We call mana, the life energy that is in all things, especially things that are healthy. So when you're in dis-ease or disorder, physically, Lomihaha is part of the Lomi practices that a Lua practitioner may have applied. And Lua being the Hawaiian battle art. And that battle art, the art of the Hawaiian warrior, if you would, art and science, I would say, was really another aspect of Ho'oponopono, the art and science of balancing spiritually. So I like to say that these are two faces of the same coin. That on one hand, there's the spiritual balancing, the cleansing of one's mind, heart, and spirit, karmic, if you would, even disconnecting from ancestral influences, cleaning up with my past in order to move forward. That's Ho'oponopono, the high level discussion. But on the physical plane, when the imbalances between me and others, me and the land, a community against a community, that's when the physical practice of Lua would come in. And we continue to practice it today, not here in Hawaii, but globally. They call it war, right? But the object was, in Hawaiian culture, it was for the purpose of bringing back balance to the land, bringing balance back to the community. And once we achieved that so-called physical rebalance, we would then go back to the spiritual balance and close that activity with Ho'oponopono, to ask for forgiveness and extend it to others so that we could move forward with Aloha as a community, feeding one another, caring for one another. because ultimately that was the intent. So
Mhm.
lomiha is that practice of realigning bone, muscle, and energy by understanding it. But it's connected to the spiritual practice of Ho'oponopono, of realigning one's spirit, mind, and body. The physical and spiritual diseases, even the conscious ones, mental ones, that are often created in times of war, times of distress or dis-ease. And war doesn't necessarily mean between others. You know, there's the war within many times. The war with ourselves, our mind and our heart. So that's a different kind of battle. And the battle art of Lua is not just the physical, but also a very spiritual one. It allows us to align ourselves. So these three particular practices are intertwined, as I said, and I'm very fortunate that Kupuna were prepared and willing to share that with me and allow me to carry it forward.
They seem very complementary. I imagine it's
They really are.
as a kind of internal balancing to carry them in tandem. Yeah. So.
Yeah, it's funny because I've had some people say you're like a warrior priest, if you would. But I think we find many cultures that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
You're dealing with the spiritual battles as much as you're dealing with the physical ones. And oftentimes, if you deal with the spiritual one first, the physical ones take care of themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Well, let's go ahead and dive in a little and add to the mix for the rest of the conversation of the topic of the ancestors. And maybe you could start by just helping our listeners to have the most basic context on the Hawaiian words that might come forward when thinking of the ancestors, or what's the basic frame or starting point for such a conversation? Yeah.
I think it's knowing that we come from someplace. You know, and there are those that were there before us that fed us, that allowed us to get here, good, bad, or indifferent, right? And we were all part of this continued flow. And so in Hawaiian, one of the terms, or the terms that most people refer to, are ancestors. So those that came before, the source of who we are is called kupuna. The Hawaiian word for source is puna. Man, to stand, erect, is ku puna. So the source of man, the source of the human condition, are our grandparents, those that came before. And so anyone that is not my direct parent, if you would, we refer to them as maku. But those before would be kupuna. And depending on the emphasis of the word, and when you write it out, the plural, the many, the past would be na kupuna or kupuna versus kupuna. It's all in the language and the enunciation. So interesting enough, the term kupu, or kupu kupu, is a sprout, the first thing that comes out of the ground, like a seed. So embedded in the word, the root word, kupuna, is this word for sprout. So that's one definition. There are others, but I hope that's
Is it understood that the children are ancestors returning, that there is a quality of cycling in that way, or are they seen as closely associated, the children and the ancestors?
Excuse me. Oh, I would like to say that after the overthrow, the Hawaiian spirituality and practices were, like most places, split up by the different cultural groups that came in. So it's religion versus spirituality. So I think today you'll find many people that have kind of accepted the blending of these ideas. But for, excuse me, out of my throat, the notion that when kupuna transfer or transition, they're really stepping through a doorway into another space. So they're always accessible. They're always guiding. So that's one level, is that while they may not be physical, I can connect to them spiritually. I can ask for guidance and direction. And equally so, they could come through and reach through. Like some might even say, my little itchy in my throat. Maybe one of the kupunas poking me from the back and say, nah, not so much today. You know, don't give away all the secrets. But being mindful of those kinds of things. The other concept of kupuna is that as much as they are identified as their own identities, their own spirit beings, that we are our kupuna, genetically, right? Memory-wise. This notion of intergenerational traumas, if you would, or intergenerational health. Because I am my great-grandfather as much as I am my great-great-grandmother 10 times removed. The genetic information that provided for my hair, my skin, and even perhaps the way I think or what I obsess on, all of these things that come through to us. So in many ways, we say we are our ancestors. And if we say, what would my grandparents have done in this situation? Or how did they do this? One of my elders would say, aren't you your grandfather's grandson? And if you are, then he is within you. And therefore, you can call upon that wisdom just by asking, because it has been provided to you through genealogy. So as much as they are no longer present physically, they are present within us.
Yeah, beautiful.
Gone, because we are our kupuna. And therefore, in many ways, we have a responsibility to them because that's responsibility to self. But we're also now responsible for those that come, our mo'opuna, our grandchildren, and the descendants. So in the same way that I am mo'opuna to my great-great-grandfather, right, I am going to be na kupuna to my great-great-grandchild. So the flow of kupuna is ongoing. It never really ends. So that's one way to look at it.
Beautiful. Yeah, it brings up a very common question in the realm of ancestor reverence or recovery of ancestor honoring traditions of, well, what if my family's terrible? And not in a situation where someone just had a falling out that's repairable.
Right.
But someone happens to have the bad fortune of being the children of people with truly bad character. And so it makes me wonder if in traditional Hawaiian wisdom, when someone dies, if they automatically become part of ku'upuna, or if there are rituals that are done to assist people to become well seated, or I know it's a big topic, but could you share a little bit about the spectrum of wellness or trouble among the kupuna?
Yeah, so I remember I told you about rootedness, right? Root words. So as kupu, or kupu means sprout. It's the first fern that comes out of the lava, if you would. The term kupu also means spirit, right? So that's the other side. So within that same word, you have the spirit that from which we all sprout, where we all come from. And as a result, that spirit is always there within us as well as in the space around us. And so when I am dealing with that spirit concept, I have to recognize that spirit is also energy, positive and negative. In some cultures, the term would be yin-yang, right? Yin-yang, plus minus, light, dark, up, down, in, out, right? These so concept of duality. But dualism in the native culture of this place is also embedded in mutualism, right? Where we all work together and that there is a communal type of thing. So dualism versus mutualism, the idea that there are spirits that have good as well as not so good, perhaps negative energies, if you would. Which means if, depending on where I am in my mind and heart at the time of my transition, I may or may not transition into a better place, but be stuck in the one I'm in. And it may be because of the beliefs that I hold or the fears that I carry with me. So it isn't always that kupuna who is in transition will go to that so-called light place of light. Depending on what tradition you explore this experience from, you have different definitions. So even the question that you asked is already framed from outside that cultural perspective. So we have to keep it in mind. So there are some expectations on how we define that. So presuming that there is another place, right, that isn't physical on the other side of the veil I talked about, is that there are practices and the belief systems where when a person's spirit is in transition, that they'll go to a particular place on the island, a portal, if you would, a doorway in which they could then jump into the land of the ancestors. To be welcomed and to be in that space. We call that a lena. And when they go to the lena, they can jump in, and then they will be on that other side. Their influence from that point on is, different people have different perspectives. I firmly believe that they have the ability to communicate with us as we with them, hopefully in a respectful way, because there are those uhane, as we say, or even unipili, the spirit of those that have passed, that tend to linger, right? They don't necessarily make the transition, perhaps not feeling that they were unsuccessful, in achieving their goals or objectives, incomplete, or doing other things.
Is it possible for those ones to eventually make the leap, as it were?
I believe so, and that's where Ho'oponopono comes in, right? So the notion of Ho'oponopono speak to the idea of forgiveness and forgiving. So if I have an elder multiple generations before who created imbalance in the world between him and someone else, and their descendants have had to live with that impact, as much as I would have to live with the impact of the harm done. So as we combine, even you and I, we have no idea what our ancestors did and whether they crossed paths. And there's a likelihood that they did. And if that did happen, if not in the physical or the spiritual, you and I may be sitting here at this very moment. And the work that we're about to do together is our way of bringing balance back to that experience. And so in acknowledging that my kupuna, my elders may have harmed yours, in the spirit of Ho'oponopono, I would ask you to forgive me, to forgive them for whatever we've done, to create a condition in your life that's brought you here to this room today. And anything that's done for your ancestors and your descendants, please forgive us so that, one, we can move and you can move clearly, freely, and, to achieve their highest and greatest aspirations and purpose, whatever that may be. Please forgive us. And in reciprocity, the Ho'oponopono then says, we, my ancestors and I, forgive you and your ancestors for whatever it is that you may have done in deed, word, or action that has created the condition of my life, current, past, and perhaps upcoming, that has not been so negative, so positive. And in that, we forgive you, and let you go. And in doing so, this reciprocity is forgiving and being forgiven. We clear the slate. We start brand new. And we can start moving forward. And so with our ancestors, as you asked, if someone has done something harmful or is in that place of dis-ease or disconnect, in the practice of doing Ho'oponopono and giving them forgiveness, we can let them go. So in other words, we're not just changing my present and ultimately my future, but I'm also changing my past and the relationship.
It's really...
I'm no longer dragging them around as an anchor.
Yeah.
But I'm teaching them, and that they are now free to go, because they may be sorrowful, right? They may be saying, please forgive me. But if I never hear that, and if I never disconnect, then they're going to go on to the next generation and to the next generation.
Oh, yeah.
And then multiple intergenerational trauma continues. And it isn't until those of us who have mind, presence of mind and heart, can actually go back and do that, despite what we may think physically in the present of what that means to us.
It's really beautiful, yeah.
Concept, right?
Yeah, it's really beautiful. I feel the heart, Kumu, and what you're bringing forward and the power of it. Just as a reflection, I guide people in ancestral healing work. It's become my curious day job, and I see a lot of folks, not only, but I see it especially prominent with folks of European ancestors, white people in North America, feeling really terrible about themselves ancestrally speaking, like cultural low self-esteem for, in many ways, very understandable reasons. And I think I hear you saying that there's an opportunity in there to bring a great deal of love and kindness and forgiveness and healing to those types of situations
Absolutely.
in a way that can allow for breakthrough, allow for folks to move forward, and to be, maybe we could say, even more effective at working for social and earth justice in the present.
Absolutely, Daniel. I think it's a shift in mindset and worldviews, if you would, right? I mean, I think the way we've experienced this physical plane called Earth, right? Earth with a series of continents and bodies of water that separate us. The island worldview is different. It says that the ocean connects us, right? And we're really more on an island than on a continent. And in an island, we're all related. So if you take that worldview, then we're all related. We're all islanders. And at some point in time, we all have responsibility to the island as well as to one another. Which means if I've done harm or damage to someone else on the island by deed, word, or action, or even inaction, intentionally or unintentionally, ultimately I'm hurting myself as well, because we have this interrelationship that many of us don't see or don't even acknowledge, because we rely on this so much to what we see to determine what our connections may be. So unless I'm touching you, unless I'm in the same room and I can sense you physically, there is no relationship. But when we talk about ancestors, they're not present, but we have a relationship. My descendants will have a relationship with me, if anything, by my blood, my thought, and my emotions that I pass on to them in the memories that they keep of me, right? And me of my ancestors. So, yeah, I would ask us to rethink this, that regardless of what our religious dogmas might be, if we step back and take a look at this, at a different perspective, we're all cousins, we're all related. Our cultural lenses are just ways of us connecting to that. And some of us have fallen farther away from the tree, if you would, right? The fruit that rolls too far from the tree no longer acknowledges the root of who they are and where they're from, which creates what I think you're saying and I'm experiencing as I get to speak with people all over the world as they come through Hawaii, a longing and a needing for belonging.
That's right. That's the word I was really in my mind. Belonging. Yeah.
Right? And we now live in a time where that is being replaced by belongings, whether it's a phone or a house, a car, or, the physical manifestation that if I have these belongings, I am now a member of a particular group, right? This car gives me membership to that group. This business gives me membership to this group. And that false sense of belonging, I believe, is really what's creating the angst, right? So while I may not know where I am in any part of the world while I travel, I may not know that place, I'm really not lost because I know where I belong. I know where I come from, and I know where I can go back to. Now, not all people have that. There have been diasporas all over the world where people no longer have a place to go back to, or a people, or a culture, or a practice to connect to. So consequently, we look for that in other cultures, right?
Yeah.
We look for other people. And when we do that, oftentimes by adopting those things quickly, we may actually be distancing ourselves even further from our true identities because we're mimicking or becoming something else because we're aspiring to that. But it's not really our true identity. It's a window, right? It's a remembrance of who we might be or who we could be. But I think if we're too quick to adopt other people's cultural practices because we don't know our own, oftentimes we can actually add salt to the wound because we don't really connect there. And therefore we become even more disappointed or frustrated because we can never really get in there. We can't really break through because that's not really who I am, right?
Yeah.
And that's not to say that we don't invite people. I mean, we're teaching this and sharing this to invite people to find that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm also very cautious is who are you, right? Find your identity. And if not, then create that identity. Put your blood, your sweat into this land now. Be the first of the next generation since you can't find your old one, right? So it doesn't have to stop or because you don't have a history. So you become the history. Give yourself identity, right? Into that place now. So I'm sorry, you got me on my soapbox.
No, it's great. It's great. I'm excited for the time we're going to spend together. I am, you know, a lot of what I teach is helping people to get right with their ancestors of blood and of body, which is in some ways a kind of narrow focus, but it's partly to make the point that there's goodness there. And if we know the holiness and also the turmoil and can work with that from our ancestors of blood, then if we're drawn to something other than those ways, we can approach with a more normal sizedness to us. Because I see, it's a generalization, but I would generalize that in my modest experience of sitting with folks from more intact indigenous systems and cultures, generally speaking, there's a more easeful self-esteem that a lot of indigenous folks walk with. And so I sat with this question of, well, how can one who is not indigenous, like myself and many other people, arrive at similar kinds of self-esteem, and not in a grabby, you know, hungry way? And I hear you speaking to this, it's Earth as island mindset. And when you're on an island, there's geographically enforced accountability to one another. And that accountability is actually inseparable from love and belonging and intimacy. And so in some ways, if we want more intimacy and love, we embrace our accountability to one another. So
yeah, I just got goosebumps, you know, chicken skin, as we say in Hawaii, as you're saying that, because I think that resonates with truth. It's the idea that we live in a time where so much of what we aspire to or use to measure our successes is founded and rooted in accounting, right? How much, right? Accounting processes and practices that really don't have a bottom line called aloha, right? Doesn't measure itself in how much love you've created or how much hurt you've created. That's not even on the equation, right? In fact, many times that's considered acceptable losses in the debit column. But what you just talked about is where I believe the truth is. It's that it's in accountability, not accounting, and that we find our true value and our true worth in knowing that I was accountable, because that's where I can start to make corrections, right? When I know where the gap is, hopefully I can plan to find correction. And if I don't have the capacity, to find others to help me get there, learn that. But I have to subscribe to that first, to know that I am accountable and therefore responsible, and then more importantly, response-able. I have the capacity and the ability to do that. But I have to subscribe to that. And to this notion of living on an island, there is no one more west or east, because on a circle, there's always going to be someone more west or more east. Right? So ultimately, wherever you are, do what you can to be the best that you can to others and for the places that you're in. And I think in that building of one's personal accountabilities, we become more accountable to ourselves and to others, right? But by extending ourselves to someone else, many times it begins to strengthen the whole that's in us. That now becomes a sense of belonging. I belong to you, you belong to me, not from an ownership standpoint, but from a connectivity standpoint.
Yeah, beautiful. Let's speak for a minute about land. Of course, Hawaii is so celebrated for the natural beauty, and you know, young Earth as it is there, with you know, regularly arriving. And I know that in a lot of traditions around the world that have intact systems of ancestor reverence, that the intimacy between the humans and the other than human people that's present during incarnate life extends to how people experience the ancestors, that the collective spirits or deities of plants or animals or places, rivers, volcanoes, mountains, etc., are inseparable from the human ancestors. Is more fluid in form like that in Hawaiian tradition as well?
I think so, but perhaps wouldn't use the same terms, but I think that's along the same lines. You know, my last name is Taum. My middle name is Mahealani, which is a Hawaiian word, but my last name is Chinese in its derivation. And so I come from the genealogies of both Hawaii as well as Asia, or Hawaiian Chinese. And in the Chinese culture, there is the, but lack of a better term, ancestral worship, right? Where you worship and honor. Whereas in our culture, it's not so much worship as much as it's respect. I think they are different things. And so I think how we respect our elders is a very strong part of that. So as we move forward, it's honoring that relationship and how we interact with one another. Is that when I'm talking to you, I'm actually talking to your ancestors, you know, or my ancestors are standing behind me as yours are behind you. And to my earlier point, they brought us together so that we can remedy, right? Remedy what we may have been aligned to, or that we can begin to work together in convergence, not just collaboration, to bring about these new things. So in the land itself, that's the same. So maybe the easiest and best way to acknowledge it is Hawaiians, as most people know us, refer to themselves as Kanaka Maoli today. Kanaka being human, native, Maoli being a native and of the place. So the man that is native to the place, Kanaka Maoli.
Kanaka Maoli? Yeah.
Maoli, Maoli, M-A-O-L-I. Kanaka Maoli. So we are the people that originally here, you know, and again, the realities are we all came here, but the first people here when, you know, Western contact occurred. But those are just Hawaiian terms for a term that could be used elsewhere. If you are the first person from England, you'd be called Kanaka Maoli to England, right? So the original people. But prior to that need to identify us from a grouping standpoint, our kupuna would have referred to themselves as He Hawaii'o. He Hawaii'o says, I am Hawaii. And in saying that, I would say, He Hawaii'o, that's I am Hawaii, but my father calls me Ramsay. You know? My daughter calls me dad. My wife calls me husband. You know, my father calls me son. But I am Hawaii. That's who I am. This is what they call me. My students call me Kumu. But who are you? Who am I? He Hawaii'o. And that meaning is embedded in the idea that I am Hawaii because I eat her and she eats me. The reciprocity is my nutrition, therefore my DNA, comes from the land, the food, the water that I consume, the air that I breathe, the energy that's around me. I am in it, therefore I am it. And so when I transition, my physicality, my spirituality returns to that space and now feeds the next generation and those to come. So from a very practical standpoint, it says, by eating and drinking of the land that I'm in, I am now connecting back to my ancestors because my ancestors are now me. And as I put myself into this land and into this space, my descendants will be me. He Hawaii'o is not just I am Hawaii, but we are Hawaii. If you believe in family, right? If you don't believe in family, then this doesn't mean it. So from a land standpoint, yeah, when the land was taken, it created a separation. So when you move a person of Hawaiian ancestry off of a particular piece of land to somewhere else, you've disconnected him from his family. And that's why the angst for the colonized mind and the colonized experience is so strong, because it's not just a governance issue, it's an identity issue.
Yeah.
I am my Aina, I am my ancestors. The land is my ancestor. And as my Native American cousins would say, those things that we refer to as resources, the ocean, the fish, the birds, the animals, they're not resources, they're relatives. And so to us, the wind, the land, the trees, they're all relatives. And how I treat them is how I treat myself, my family. So if you come from a thought process or a world where you don't have that level of respect, then ultimately it's a reflection of what we think of ourselves as much as it is how we think of others. So your question is a solid one. We are very much connected to Aina, as we call land, that thing that gives us life, food.
Thank you, Kumu. As we come to completion with just a few other questions, I realized we didn't speak about the the kind of legal political stuff too much, but I want to reflect back an assumption I make about Hawaii and see if there's more you want to add to that or if that checks out. And one basic thing is that the land there is illegally occupied by the U.S. government, and two, that there's tremendous cultural resilience, and Native Hawaiian language and traditions are still, despite pressures, very much alive and well and moving along despite the occupation.
Yeah, fortunately so. And fortunately, because we had elders who, like my own, were prepared to share, not only care for, but share and move it forward. And so it is I think our kuleana responsibility to continue that process, regardless of what the governance may look like. Right? It's about self-governance. And my relationship to deity, divinity, place, you, me, and the rest of the world. And so in that, I can claim my own sovereignty, which I think is really what people are really seeking out, is the ability or the space and governance that allows us to claim that sovereignty. But if you rely on a governance to do that, then we're technically victimhood. We're living in victimhood. To your point, yes, history now has demonstrated and proven to be the case that Hawaii as a kingdom, as a nation, the first non-European nation to be accepted as a nation state, was overthrown through a coup in 1893. And the subsequent actions since have never corrected that, but it did result in statehood in 1959. And so while there is a body in place called the state of Hawaii, it's predicated on the belief that an annexation of some kind, the transfer of sovereignty by secession, occurred, and that would have happened in 1895, 1898, and then the year 1900. And so during that time period, 1893, 1895, and 1900, we moved from a kingdom, were overthrown, became annexed to the United States by resolution, and then ultimately became the territory, which then led to statehood in 1959. And so that is the dominator's view of history. But the people's view of that same history acknowledges that there was really no annexation. And on an international level, it was never really codified in that way. Yet because of the influence and power of the United States, those countries that had treaties with the Kingdom of Hawaii pulled away and did not live up to their treaty responsibilities in terms of protecting her as it may be. So there are those of us that understand that we are Hawaiian nationals as much as we are part of the United States. I was born into the United States, again, in the year, because of the state of Hawaii being born in 1959, and me just a few months later. So from that standpoint, I'm American by birth in terms of an occupation. Right. My identity and being born here, I am native to this place. This is where my ancestors are. This is where they're buried. This is where I come from. And so I am technically a Hawaiian national, born in the nation of Hawaii, which is occupied by the United States of America, and looking for that resolution or remedy. Of course, that opens up a whole new debate. Is it really proper? If we make that correction, is that really good for Hawaiians? Is it really good for Hawaii? Is it really good for the world? That's a whole different debate. So sometimes you can fix something, but never really correct something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I follow.
So, we have to be very mindful of that. So that is the condition, that Native Hawaiians who claim their nationalism or the national identity back to the Kingdom of Hawaii. And the caveat being, it wasn't just Native Hawaiians. There were others of other nationalities that lived here, Chinese, Japanese, even American, who were born in these islands, nationalized here, and they are all part of the nation of Hawaii. So they, by political status, are considered Native Hawaiian. But those of Maoli blood from the land that came through that process, that's a claim that very few can actually make. But under political discussions, if we move into that another time, another debate, there is this understanding that we are living in an occupied space. And how to decolonize ourselves while still in that space and not using the tools of the occupier to do it, to become the evil, to fight evil.
Beautiful.
And that's where I think many of us are challenged, to live aloha as we promote aloha.
That's the final question I wanted to bring to you today is, in light of illegal occupation, ongoing racism and problematic views, colonialist mindset, cultural appropriation, funky tourism industry, and different things like that, what helps you, Kumu, to wake up in the morning, tune into your kupuna, lead with love, and just like meet life in a really awesome way?
Yeah, I subscribe to a higher order, if you would, and I try to push the ceiling up a little higher. If I operate in a low ceiling, low vibration, then I could easily subscribe to victimhood and be fighting it constantly. But I've subscribed to and believe firmly in something greater. That in this experience, we have now the opportunity, the fact that you're asking the question, that we're having this, is giving me an opportunity to share that, right? And so as people come, then they learn about themselves as well as us, and that Hawaii and Aloha now, because of our condition, has an opportunity to advocate for a new condition. Because if everything was copacetic, we wouldn't, right? You wouldn't learn about Aloha as this process. You wouldn't learn about Ho'oponopono as a way of forgiveness, because no one would feel that. Sometimes the tension that is out there that we call pain is really the doorway to health. It's the thing that puts us on the right path. As we would say, the place of activity is where the ocean meets the land. When the waves crash in that turmoil, to the person who's looking for calm, that's not where you want to be. But interesting, that's where the action is. That's where the growth is. That's where the food is happening. It's that place of interaction. And so I find that being in this place of interaction allows me and allows those of us who choose to be there to hopefully have a conversation of enlightenment rather than one that is rooted in darkness. And I think that's what carries me. Mind you, I'm not immune. I may be aware, but I'm not immune. There are obviously times when the frustration gets to you. But I think that higher order, knowing that we are on a path to enlightenment. And if our condition can help others, then I accept that condition. I don't want to stay here, but I certainly want to make it better. And in the process, bringing others with us. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah,
Daniel.
beautiful. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. And I'm really looking forward to the shared time in April. And is there any other final words or anything from the heart you'd want people to hear?
I just implore people to rethink and feel and make that connection between head and heart. And recognize that oftentimes the things that are right in front of us that seem to be the greatest challenges are the gifts that really then enable us to go deeper and to begin to recognize. So whether it's governance, politics, geo, whatever's going on around us, it is what it is. And what we need to do is find a way to translate that into something greater and recognize that supply side thought, that which we bring into the room, isn't always where the answers are. Right? In fact, these challenges that confront us daily may be the sources of those new answers. But we have to ask the right questions. So
beautiful. Yeah, thank you. And just as a reminder for anyone who'd like more information about Kumu's offerings, it's Ramsay Taum, RamsayTaum.com. And for more information about the offering in April or about my practice, is ancestralmedicine.org. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Daniel. Aloha.
Aloha.